So, good morning, everybody. I will continue on this chapter about internal migration. And before I continue on the exact slide that I stopped last class, I just wanted to highlight something here. So this graph shows the age-specific migration rates, right? So it's pretty much migration rates estimated for each one of these ages here, and usually migration, since it's a rare event, we calculate it by age groups, by 5-year age groups. So 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and so on until an open-ended age group at the end here. But even when we do that, even when we estimate age-specific migration rates by age groups in order to increase the sample size of people who might have migrated within that age group, we might see a lot of variation across these age groups. So this curve here could have a pattern that's not so smooth as the one that we see on the screen. Even for this one here that's talking about internal migration for all the US, so it's a really big sample that was used to estimate these migration rates, you still see this kind of oscillations here, right? And sometimes these oscillations, they are showing us a pattern of like how migration is actually happening by age groups. But these oscillations might be because not as many people migrate in specific ages, and would be better to kind of model these curves and make them a little bit more smooth, right? So there is a methodological strategy, pretty much like implementation of a mathematical model in which we try to make these rates don't oscillate so much by age group. And that's what we call modeling migration rates. So if you, in the future, you're trying to do something more advanced, trying to replicate, for example, this graph here, but not for the US. Let's say that I want to estimate the migration rates of people coming to Brazos County, a much smaller geographical area. This graph is going to have many more oscillations. So in order to kind of smooth the graph and have something easier to understand, like these examples here for China, Portugal, and Brazil, you can model these migration rates, and then they become a little bit more smoother. The mathematical model kind of provides you the exact slope for each sub-portions of these curves. And this is this material that I made available in our course website. So in our course website, under the chapter 8, Internal Migration, I put information here from Professor James Raymer that he shows exactly how to do this, how to model these migration rates so they look a little bit more smooth, mostly when you're analyzing migration to small areas. And he has examples in SPSS and Excel. No, this example here, he uses a software called Table Curve 2D, which is really easy to estimate, but of course, it's not a free software. It's not a free software package. And he shows the step-by-step of how to do this here. And I just, and I put it here, his material, his course material in a compressed zip file. And I put some examples of rates that can be smooth or apply this mathematical model, both in SPSS and Excel format. SPSS is a statistical software, and you can also, but I also made it available here in Excel. And this is the website where people can buy the Table Curve 2D. Of course, this is for people who want to go further on demographic studies. I will also show throughout this course, throughout this lecture, some examples of maps in which I try to see where internal migrants are located within the US. And those maps, I use this GIS software, Geographic Information System software called Geoda. And Geoda, it's a free software package. So you can just go here to the website and you can download it. and it has a lot of information. So all the manual information, how to use it, it's all available in their website. It's really well organized. So these 3 points here are more technical if you want to model migration curves by age, so they don't show so much variation. You can use the model migration models, the mathematical migration models developed by Rogers and Castro, and James Raymer shows how to do that in TurboCurve 2D. This software here is to generate your own maps. And then another set of content here in the website. This demographer, William Frey, he's a demographer at the Brookings Institution. And in 2019, we saw a huge decline on internal migration in the US. Fewer than 10% of Americans are moving within the US. And then he tries to explain that, give the main reasons, and I will discuss that topic also in our lecture. And this is just a short article that he wrote within the Brookings Institution website. So this is from data from 2019. So that's before the pandemic. And also the short interview that he provided to NPR, 5 minutes long, in which he summarizes the probable reasons in his findings related to decline of internal migration in the US, right? So just to emphasize that we have some extra material here in the course website related to internal migration. And in the previous class, we ended talking about these migration rates and ratios, right? So we have the in-migration rate, the out-migration rate, net migration rate, gross migration rate, and all of them are called rates because technically the denominator of all these formulas here are the population at risk of experiencing the event. But I mentioned that the in-migration rate is not completely appropriate because if you put in the denominator the population at the area of destination, if the population area of destination is used in the denominator, that population is already there. So it's not at risk of entering that area, right? But still we use the term rate for these specific indicators here because we are putting in the denominator people who have the chance of experiencing the event, which is measured in the numerator. And the migration efficiency indicator here is called migration efficiency ratio, not rate, because we pretty much get two different measures, net migration and gross migration rate, and see the size of one compared to the other, right? So the denominator of this indicator here is not people who have the chance of experiencing the event being measured in the numerator. That's why it's called a ratio. And as I mentioned before, all these indices refer to in-migration, out-migration, the population, the denominator. And we stopped here in the previous class. So just remembering the first chapter this semester, we talked about that in a population should try to project the population to the future. We have to know those that are entering and getting out of that population. People can enter a population through fertility or through in-migration. And they can get out through death or through out-migration. So the out-migration rate here that was explained in the previous slides is analogous to the crew death rate. So there's this overall measure of how many people are getting out of a specific country. The in-migration rate is analogous to the crude birth rate, the overall amount of people that it's entering a specific population. See, if you're talking here about internal migration, you're talking about people getting out of a specific area to other areas within the same country and getting in from other areas within the same country. And the net migration rate is analogous to the rate of natural increase and decrease, right? But we also know that the crude death rate and the crude birth rate, they are really, they are really simplistic because they don't take into account age composition of a specific population. And as I showed to you here, migration is also important to estimate by age groups because the chances of migrating vary by age. So when you're trying to understand migration patterns for a specific area, you don't only estimate the overall in-migration rate and out-migration rate or net migration. You also look at the age-specific migration rates estimated for each age group, okay? So, in just one example of these overall measures of migration is provided in the course textbook, right? So this is state-to-state domestic migration, so internal migration for the states of California, Nevada, New York, and Texas. And these are the overall migration flows. So California, between 2004 and 2005, 448,000 people entered the state, coming from other states in the US, 717,000 left the state, going to other states within the US. This number plus this number tells us that an overall almost like 1.2 million people either left or entered California from and to other states within the US between 2004 and 2005. And this number of in-migrants minus out-migrants, we show that California within this period lost 268,000 people through migration more than what they gained, right? So the net migration state California here was negative. The same thing for the state of New York, and for Nevada and Texas, they gained more people compared to how many they lost. Texas gained more compared to how many they lost. And this is just internal migration. People coming from other places within the US and going out to other places within the US, other states. And then we can estimate the indicators. The in-migration rate, we just get this information here and divide by the size of the population, the overall population in California. Out-migration rate, we get the number of out-migrants and divide by the population in California. In both of these cases, we multiply it by 1,000, right? And like I said, here we're talking about in-migration to California. So these are 448,000 people who entered California. And we are divided by the population in California. And this denominator is not completely appropriate because the population that's already in California is not at risk of coming to California. But how to interpret this number? We saw like around 13 people entering California between this period of 2004 and 2005 for every 1,000 people already living in California. And the out-migration rate says that for every 1,000 people living in California, around 21 of them left California to other states in the US within the specific period, right? And the denominator here is more appropriate because that's the population of California. The population in California, the denominator is the one with a chance of getting out of California. And the gross migration rate overall for every 1,000 people in California, 33.4 either entered or got out of California, right? And that's pretty much if you add these two here, right? If you add these two here, you get exactly 33.4. And the net migration rate, you're saying that for every 1,000 people in California, California lost 8 more people than they received within this period. So more people getting out. Why is it important to estimate these rates? Because these numbers of California, they look really big, which is important for us because it gives us an idea of the magnitude But we also have to take into account what's the population at risk has a chance to migrate. So we have to take into account the size of California. And overall, for the overall amount of people moving in and moving out of California, the gross migrants, we had 23 more people getting out of California than moving in for every 100 individuals. So the migration efficiency ratio, this number here is in percentage terms. These ones here are for every 1,000 people. And then you could say, oh, Nevada, you don't see as much because you just see 129,000, 103,000, 26,000. These numbers are so much smaller than California. If you think about the absolute number, it might seem small, but if you take into account the size of the state of Nevada, then you see that the rates are actually stronger than the ones that we measured to California, right? For every 1,000 people living in Nevada, 56 enter the state between 2004 and 2005. Out of 1,000 people living in Nevada, around 45 of them left the state. Out of 1,000 people living there, 101 either entered or left the state. Again, this number here, pretty much, you add these two, you get the gross migration rate. And out of 1,000 people living in Nevada, you had 11 more people entering Nevada than getting out, net migration rate. And you had around, for the overall amount of people entering, getting out, 11% of them entered the state than got out. And what's interesting to see here, exactly these measures of net migration rates, that you see them being negative for California and New York, losing more population than gaining, and the populations of Nevada and Texas gaining more people than losing through migration, right? So that's a really simple exercise with these really basic numbers here. You can estimate all these rates and ratio, and you can do this analysis for other states in the US. And you have information in the Census Bureau website to do this even at the county level, okay? Now, I'm gonna go through this overall trends in internal migration in the US. Talk about some historical trends and then going into more recent years. So during the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a steady stream of migration set in western areas beyond the Mississippi River. Between the late 1800s and 1960s, the South had been the major exporter of people. So southern states having a lot of people getting out of their areas up to the 1960s. But then, since the 1970s, the major interregional migration flows within the country have been from east to west and from north to south. So it reverses a little bit. It was more from the south to the north, and now it starts to be more from the north to the south. But also from east to west, migration continues to go that way as well. And when we are talking about these regions, the graphs that are showing in the textbook, they're based on these major regions here, right? The census regions. The West, which includes Alaska and Hawaii, Midwest, Northeast, and South. So this graph here, it's based on this graph, the next findings and the next, based on this map, the next findings and the next graphs are calculated, trying to see how many people are entering and getting out of these regions. But if you wanted, you could go even slower. Instead of using these 4 major regions, you could go into the census divisions. So here, for example, in the West, you have the Pacific and the Mountain divisions. In Midwest, you have West, North, Central, and East, North, Central divisions. And of course, within the divisions, you have the states. And within the states, you have the counties, right? So you can go even further and do analysis of internal migration for smaller geographical areas. So this slide here pretty much is summarizing this graph. And this graph is looking at 5-year domestic net migration for the 4 regions that I showed in the previous map: South, West, Midwest, and Northeast. So for every 5-year period between 1970 and 2010, the South has been the only region to have continuously experienced positive net migration. So this graph here is about net migration. You see that the South region, the net migration declined a little bit in these last decades, but all the numbers here are above 0. So the South region as a whole has been receiving more people than losing. And the West region has moved from positive to negative in 1995 and to slightly positive in 2010. The South and West were popular destinations, particularly among graduate degree holders who are 25 years old or older. So the West region was also positive, and then in 95 started to lose more people than gaining, but then in more recent years it's pretty much net migration close to 0. The same amount of people moving in and moving out. In South and West usually attracts people with better level, like young people with high levels of education. In the Midwest and Northeast regions have continuously had negative net migration. So Midwest and Northeast, kind of like not so negative anymore in more recent years, but it's still these numbers below 0, which means more people moving out than moving in. A historical migration flow that happened within the US is called the Great Migration. During the Great Migration between 1910 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans moving from the rural South areas to the Midwest, Northeast, and Pacific coast, right? So almost 90% of African Americans were living in the South in 1900. By the end of this period, by 1970, the states of New York, Illinois, and California had received large numbers of African Americans. So African American Great Migration from the South to the North happened during the 20th century. And why they were moving from the South to the North? Because they were seeking better socioeconomic opportunities for their families. This migration contributed to social, economic, demographic, and cultural transformations in northern cities. And the idea is that because they were experiencing high levels of poverty, discrimination, racism in all these southern areas, they moved up to the north, and they, in order to improve their life standards. And this graph here, and this graph I don't think is in the textbook, that's from another source, from this article by Tolney in 2003. Here, we have African Americans living in non-southern areas. This, the black curve here is showing those African Americans that were born in southern states, but now are living outside of the South. So these people here are really migrants, right? So they were born in southern states, and now they reside in other states outside of the South area, South region. So it increased from less than 1 million to around 4 million, a little less than 4 million, according to data from 1990. So it's a lot of people that were born in the South, African Americans, and then they are living somewhere else now. And the columns, the gray columns, are the total numbers of African Americans living in non-southern states. So these are African Americans. They can be in these columns here. They can be born outside of the South or be born in the South and now live somewhere else. So the columns here, they include both migrants and non-migrants. It's just to give an idea that the overall population of African Americans increased a lot during this period of 1900 to 1990, living outside of southern states, of southern areas. And this map here kind of shows the major migration corridors that African Americans moved between 1916 and 1930. So you had the Southwest to Midwest and Far West, the blue corridor here. The South Central to Midwest, the purple, and the South to Northeast, the yellow corridor. So in just also this map highlighting which cities they went more often throughout this period. And then from 1940 to 1970, you have additional places that they start to move with higher degree. But then you start to see more dispersion of African Americans throughout the country. But I will show with my own research project data that is still the concentration, the places where African Americans go within the US are really specific areas, right? But that's also the case for Hispanics, and that's also the case for Native Americans. The white population tends to go more overall to all the places, but Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans go to specific areas, and I'm going to show towards the end of this lecture. And this is really important. Even today, we are learning about a lot about that. So the Census Bureau right now is linking census data from the 1930s and 1940s to data that they collected in more recent years, like the American Community Survey. So the American Community Survey, like I told you before, we have data from 2005 to 2020. And the Census Bureau, with this advanced matching methodology, they have been trying to link people who answered the decennial census back in 1930, 1940 with the American Community Survey. And by doing that, the analysis that we can do is to see those people that moved out from the South back in the 1930s and the 1940s, exactly related to the Great Migration, those that moved to the northern areas, how are their children doing in terms of education attainment and earnings, comparing to the children of African Americans that stay in the South? And the major finding there is that those African Americans that moved to northern areas based on data from the 1930 and 1940 census, their children nowadays are doing better in terms of education attainment and earnings than the children of African Americans that did not move out of southern areas. So that's a really clear case that this migration, that people were looking for better life conditions, actually had the effect that migrants wanted for themselves. And when I talk about the children of these migrants that moved in the 30s or 40s to northern areas, their children are already adults, right? This is pretty much their offspring. Their children now are already adults. So that's why we can measure education and earnings of these people. And then we can compare with the earnings and education of those people who are sons and daughters of African Americans that did not leave the southern areas. And the sons and daughters of African Americans that moved to northern areas are doing better, okay? So that's a really clear case of how migration can have intergenerational effects, in this case measured by education and earnings. Whites also moved to the north in large numbers between 1910 and 1970. However, whites did not experience these advantaged positions as blacks in the South. So when they moved from the South to the North, they already had, on average, better socioeconomic conditions. Segregation and concentration of poverty in the growing northern ghettos limited residential mobility of African Americans. So African Americans who moved to the north, on average, they already had lower socioeconomic status compared to whites that also moved from the south to the north. And when they got into the north, they found habitation and places to live and in areas that had worse conditions overall, right? So they were still, they didn't experience as much socioeconomic mobility because of all these problems with segregation. But I just mentioned to you now, this more recent data is showing that, okay, comparing to white migrants that moved from the south to the north, African Americans did not do so good in terms of going up in the mobility scale, but they improved more than the ones left behind. And one fact is that their sons and daughters are doing better now than the sons or daughters of those that stayed back behind. This historical process has to be understood in order to further investigate Black migration and mobility. And that's exactly what's being done right now. So these articles that I mentioned to you that link census into the American Community Survey, more recently, historical census to recent American Community Survey, they have been done by researchers at the Census Bureau and all the universities. They have been published just now, more recently, in 2020 and 2021, okay? After the Great Migration, changes contributed to the desire by Black inner city residents to relocate to suburbs and to better neighborhoods within the North. So we start to have the migration evolution, right? So people might move from rural areas to urban areas, and as they improve economically, they start to move to other urban areas with better housing, with better schools, with better access to health services. Cross-generation familial and cultural connections contributed for Blacks returning to the South. I mentioned to you, for every stream of migration, there is a counter stream of migration. Exactly because of the Great Migration, a lot of African Americans going from South to North, there is also the opposite trend in more recent years, African Americans going from the North to the South. And that we see in my research project with more recent data. But this return migration only started happening only after changes took place in the South towards socioeconomic and political equality for Blacks. Then return migration became attractive for African Americans to come back to the South. After the 1970s, we see a reversal migration, younger, college-educated migrants moving to more prosperous and post-civil rights South. Cities and metro areas of Atlanta, Dallas here, Houston here, are attracting a lot of migrants, both internal and international migrants. And they are the most popular destinations for whites, Blacks, and new immigrant minorities. So Houston has a really diverse population and is attracting a lot of this diverse population because it gives opportunities for them to improve their lives over there. Migration varies by age, as I showed you in that graph of my age-specific migration rates. Today, young adults are more likely to move than anyone else. The reasons are related to school, people going into another city to attend college, or because they get the first job because of employment, or because they get married and then they settle in another place. So people between 20 and 29 years of age in the US are more likely to migrate. And people with at least 40 years of age are the ones less likely to move. Older people are more likely to stay in a specific area, right? Migration also varies by education. Highly educated people are more likely to migrate. They have better social networks. They know about more possibilities of work outside of, in different places in the US. And they are more likely to take the risk because they can improve their socioeconomic status, their earnings, by moving to other areas. The farther they move, the more likely education will play a major role in the decision of moving. Of course, lower educated people also migrate, but when they migrate, they're more likely to migrate into closer cities, into closer areas. More educated people, when they migrate, they tend to migrate into more farther areas, okay, farther away areas. Migration also varies by occupation. White-collar workers are the most mobile occupation group. Farm and service workers are the least mobile. Manual workers are more likely to move locally, and people who are not in the labor force are also likely to move. So people that usually have better education levels and are in white-collar occupations, they are more likely to migrate. People who are in occupations related to farming or service migrate less. And manual workers who usually tend to have lower levels of education, when they move, they tend to move to nearby areas. And of course, people who are not in the labor force or also who are unemployed, they tend to move to other areas in order to improve their lives and find jobs, right? The correct term here, the people who are not in the labor force, these are people who do not have a job and they are not looking for a job. Unemployed people are those who do not have a job, but are looking for a job. In both cases, those not in the labor force and those unemployed are more likely to move to other areas, right? Either because they are more flexible and they can move, even if they are not looking for jobs, or because they are looking for jobs in the case of unemployed people. And there are consequences of migration, right? I showed at the beginning of this chapter that diagram in which we try to explain why people migrate, right? And I showed you also the proximate determinants of migration. Contextual factors influence life course transitions, and life course transitions influence migration flows. But also migration, after it happens, it has consequences into the society. The decision to migrate is likely reached when advantages of moving to destination outweigh disadvantage of staying in the origin. That discussion that I had with you guys in previous class about the costs and benefits of migrating. Population movements have effects on the places of origin and destination. They also affect movers and non-movers. When a rural area is losing a lot of people, and as we just mentioned here, people who are better educated between the ages of 20 and 29, so really those that are in the labor market are more likely to get out from these areas. If rural areas start to lose a lot of these people, the rural areas will experience even further declines in economic development. They will face a lot of challenges. And these people, when they move to the areas of destination, will also experience changes. You have more people now, higher supply of better educated people moving to those areas. So that will change the economic dynamic. So that affects both areas of origin and destination, and will affect the lives of those that did not get out of the origin and those that were already in the destination. The effect of moving for an individual migrant differs from the effect of an aggregate migrant population. So some migrants, when they move, they might experience improvements in their life. Some of them might be less likely, and the individual changes that they have in their life is not the same as you have for the aggregate. Just in the case of the Great Migration, if you take a specific white migrant that moved from the south to the north and an African American who moved from the south to the north, individually, they had different improvements in their lives. More likely that the white migrant had better changes in their lives in terms of education, income, both from himself and for his family. But overall, to the aggregate population, that move was good for everybody, for African Americans and white migrants, right? So exactly going a little bit more in detail about the effects of individual and also on the overall effect. Major effect of migration to an individual migrant, whether social, economic, political, physical characteristics of new environment are more favorable or preferable than those of previous residents. So if African Americans are moving from the South to the North, and they are getting off the South because of segregation, because of discrimination, because of racism, and they get to the North, and there are better housing conditions, better opportunities of schools for their children, better acceptability in the area of destination, that will have a really great effect on the individuals. But if they get into the North and they still face segregation, they still live in the neighborhoods that don't provide good schooling, that might have some beneficial effects to them, but overall is not going to be so good because they still face segregation and live in areas with lower socioeconomic status, right? And we migrate because of the perceived idea that the area of destination will give us a better condition of life than the place that we live right now. And these preferences depend on the migrants' personal observations and experiences. And we don't know everything about an area of destination before we move there. But if I have previous friends and family who moved there, that might increase my chances to be successful in the destination. These preferences will also depend on whether migrant possesses the right skills to adapt to the new area. These migrants moving from the South to the North during the Great Migration, which kind of jobs the North was needed at that time, the qualifications of those migrants attaining those needs, that will also influence whether individuals will benefit from that migration. Whether migrants are readily accepted, don't face discrimination. And the effects of aggregate migration. Like I mentioned before, the area of origin is affected by the number and type of migrants moving out of the area. If you have a rural area losing a lot of young adults that are really active, are ready to work, and they get out of those areas, the people left behind will have more difficulty making those areas growing economically. So that will have an effect on the people left behind. A large out-migration will significantly affect an area's potential population growth and economic development as well. If the net migration rate is highly negative and the population is largely elderly, then you might see a decline in the size of the population and also fewer people in labor ages to work in the jobs and to produce economic development in the area, okay? Some effects of immigration. There are two ways in which immigration contributes to the increase of population in the area of destination. So I just mentioned to you here the example of African Americans moving from the South to the North during the Great Migration. Those migrants moving from the South to the North, the direct ones that used to live there and they are all living in the North, they are the direct effect on the changes in population size in the destination. So the net number of immigrants constitutes a direct effect of population increase. These are the migrants themselves who were born or used to live in the South, and now they are moving to the North. They will influence, they will have an effect on population size in the destination. They are the direct effect. After they get there, they might have children. Though these internal migrants have children in a higher scale than the population that was already living there, if they have more children, then that will have a really high indirect effect. If they have fewer children, it might also have a high indirect effect, because now you might have this larger population labor ages, but in the next generations, you might not have as many people. So a migrants themselves moving from one area to the other influence population changes in the area of origin and destination, and in the destination really clearly in a direct way. And the children that they have will affect that area of destination, and that's called the indirect effect. So the number of children born to the immigrants after they arrive at the destination will be the indirect effect. So what about the magnitude? The magnitude of direct effect depends on the relative size of migrants compared to the size of the population in the area of destination, right? And the magnitude of the indirect effect depends on the relative levels of fertility of migrants comparing to the levels of fertility of people who are already living in the area of destination. And this slide here, that's the one that I summarize the article written by William Frey in 2019, and I put the link to his article in the course website, and he also provided a short interview to NPR, and it's also in the course website, and the direct link is this one here, you can listen to it. So overall, what he says is, the US has been experiencing the lowest levels of internal migration since the 1940s. For example, around 20% of the people in the US between 1950 and 1960 migrated within the US. And he says that the major reason for that is related because the US had a really robust economy, a lot of economic growth going on in the country. So people saw opportunities to improve their lives somewhere else. So they would migrate a lot, 20% of the people. But then, according to data from the American Community Survey in 2019, less than 10% of Americans moved within the US between 2018 and 19. And then he started to speculate about reasons for decline. He mentions, first reason is because we have an older population now. And as we talked in previous slides, older people are less likely to migrate. Another thing that happened in the US, job opportunities, good job opportunities now are more decentralized in the US. I can get good jobs being all over the US, with all different states, all different areas. So the labor market is more homogeneous across the country. Still, some areas have more opportunities, but we can find good jobs in different areas in the country. So I don't have to move as much. I can just graduate from school and move to a nearby city. For example, here in Texas, or instead of having to go to another state to find a good job, right? He also mentions, in opposition to the robust economic growth that we had in the 1950s and 60s, is that in the 2008 economic recession, that kind of made economy don't grow as much and get actually a recession. And then we didn't have many job opportunities around the US, so people didn't move as much as they did in previous decades. And also because of technological advancements, people are more likely to find jobs in which they can telecommute and they can work from home. And now, this article was written in 2019, before the pandemic. So now the pandemic, because of the pandemic, what do we think the levels of internal migration will be? Likely, internal migration will decline even more, right? Aging population, people are still getting older, right? There is a paper that was just presented at the conference of the Population Association of America that happened, that Thursday that you guys had the exam 3, I was attending this conference online. It was Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And I presented my papers, discussed some others, but then was this other one, a researcher, Robert Bozek. He used to be at the Rand Corporation where I used to work as well, and now he is in a research institute at Rice University. And he did an analysis in which he tries to see the effects on the chances of people migrating depending on their age, on the specific year that they migrate, and also on their cohort. There is this technique that demographers use, it's called the age period cohort effect, right? So he tries to see that. And he knows, yeah, older people, less likely to migrate. Yeah, in more recent years, we have lower levels of migration. But for example, William Frey here, he was saying, oh no, maybe internal migration might increase again, might go up to 12% of people a year instead of only 10%. But according to this study by Robert Bozek, so yeah, older people, less likely to migrate, age. In more recent years, people are migrating less, year, the effect of period. But what about the long term? Is it going to go up? And what he sees is that older cohorts, like baby boomers, those that were born after the World War II, overall, they were more likely to migrate. Newer generations are less likely to migrate. They are more tied into the places where they already live. So according to these new studies by Robert Bozek, actually, the decline in internal migration is also linked to cohort effects. Baby boomers more likely to migrate within the US, newer generations less likely. Back to the pandemic now. William Frey mentioned, oh yeah, the economic recession made people migrate less because there were not as many jobs available out there. That's exactly what happened during the pandemic. Of course, like the pandemic had a really huge effect on employment. So unemployment rates increased a lot, like right around April, May, June of 2020, when the pandemic first started. And then afterwards, unemployment rates started to decline again. It's getting even better now. But overall, what the pandemic made was a lot of jobs were lost. So people don't have other places to go to find for jobs. And there is the health effect, right? The health effect. I mean, of course, in the US, we don't have a centralized government that avoid people from moving internally like Chinese people have. But people were more scared about traveling, right? Of course, now just the mask mandate is not in place anymore for air travel. So people are feeling more comfortable about that. But still, the pandemic affected internal migration flows, both because of the economic effect, increase in unemployment, and because of health issues. And during the pandemic, I mean, we had this huge technological advancement now in these last 2 years. Teaching classes through Zoom. We have like 83 students enrolled in this class. We have 5 students here in person. The others are either watching this class in YouTube, 20 others. So let's say 25, yeah, and 60 are not even watching it. So that's a different thing. But for those that want to watch this class, they don't have to come in person, at least up to this semester. Next semester, I might stop with that to at least force a little bit more people and not being so depressing for me having so few people in the classroom out of 83, right? We have all these controversial groups of people coming here to campus and talking about all these controversial topics. They attract more people than my students in the classroom. But telecommunication, working from home, it's now much more likely to happen because of all these technological advancements that we had in these last 2 years. So, cohort effects as measured by Robert Bozek. Telecommuting, the effects of the pandemic both in terms of economic recession and health reasons, all that might still make people migrate less within the US, okay? And the US is getting even more decentralized. The opportunities for jobs are getting, again, all different areas in the country are growing, are providing opportunities in the same level. It's not so centralized in fewer big cities, okay? And now, the last portion of this chapter that I will cover here is related about spatial analysis of where people are migrating within the US. So that's kind of like the first portion, the first results that I got in this research project, that I'm trying to see where people are migrating within the US. And instead of just looking at those 4 major regions as we saw in the graphs from the textbook, I tried to look at other areas within the US. So we pretty much divide the US in 1,005 areas. These areas provided to us by the Census Bureau in public available data. The main idea is that we know in spatial association that people are not randomly distributed over space, right? We know that more people live in big cities. And because of that, we also know that people move with higher chances to some areas than to others. I just mentioned the previous slide. Oh, now the US is becoming less centralized in terms of economic opportunities, but it's still, right? Bigger cities attract more people, bigger cities have more people moving out. So people don't move to areas within the US with the same chances. So in this exercise here, I use this technique, or I estimate this indicator called Local Indicator of Spatial Association, LISA, that identifies areas or groups of areas where you have high levels of immigration or low levels of immigration, and those areas that have a lot of immigrants coming to them, but not as many around it. And some areas that do not have as many immigrants coming to them, but a lot of immigrants going to surrounding areas. So what's are called the local clusters and spatial outliers. Local clusters, high immigration surrounded by low immigration surrounded by low, and spatial outliers is the opposite, high surrounded by low and low surrounded by high. And this indicator was developed by Luke Anselin, who is a professor who also developed that software that makes maps, Geoda, that I put the link in the course website. He's now based in the University of Chicago. And this indicator estimates the contribution of each one of the sub-areas that we have data available. And how we define the neighbors of a specific areas. There are different techniques in how we can identify neighbors. We can identify, say, oh, someone is a neighbor. It's an area that's within 100 miles or 1,000 miles, if you want, or 10 miles. In this case here, I'm saying that the neighbors are those areas that share the borders, what's called the queen contiguity, using the chess way of talking about like the queen being that piece that moves to all surrounding areas, right? So the neighbor areas are those that share the border with a specific area. We analyze concentration of internal migrants in areas of destination in the US. Look, spatial analysis can be done for any indicator. I can have, for example, the total fertility rate for each one of the areas in the US and see which areas have high levels of fertility surrounded by high fertility. Mortality, I can also estimate life expectancy at birth for small areas and see areas that have a high life expectancy at birth surrounded by high and low surrounded by low. In this case, I do this exercise for internal migration. Areas, I compare the level of internal migration that some areas are receiving and compare to the surrounding, right? So what we pretty much estimate is these 4 groups of areas, like I mentioned before, the spatial clusters and the spatial outliers. The spatial cluster are those areas with high levels of a specific indicator surrounded by areas with high levels of that indicator. They are classified as high. Again, that indicator can be any indicator that you might want to analyze. I'm analyzing internal migration. The low clusters are those areas with low levels of a specific indicator surrounded by areas with low levels. And the spatial outliers are those areas that differ from their neighbors. So areas with high levels of a specific indicator surrounded by areas with low, and low-high areas with low levels for a specific indicator surrounded by areas with high levels. Okay? And the example that I'm going to show you here, I'm going to try to analyze the concentration of internal migrants in areas of destination. So I'm analyzing people entering specific areas in the US. And the information on area of residence that I get is on information about migration. You remember the American Community Survey, we know where the person lives right now, and we also know where the person lived exactly 1 year before. So we know the area of residence in 2019, and we also know the area of residence 1 year before, so where the person was living in April 1st, 2018. For areas of destination, public available data that we can download it on EPAMS, on the EPAMS website, epams.org, the website that I showed to you. Areas of destination of current residence, public available data has information on the public use microdata areas. They are called PUMAs. They are the lowest level of geographic aggregation. Why in the PUMAs in 2019, we had, I think, around 2,351 PUMAs. Why the Census Bureau doesn't make that information available at the county level using this more refined data? Because at the county level, I would break at the population in around 3,500 counties, I would be able to identify specific individuals. So what the Census Bureau does is, like, for counties that have small populations, they group some of them and they will form one PUMA. In some counties that have big populations, they will disaggregate them and they will form more than one PUMA. And the PUMAs have at least 100,000 people living within them. So we still have a good amount of data available to analyze it. But the same public available data, when we get information about residents 1 year ago, the area of lowest level of geographic aggregation that we have is not even the PUMA. Are groups of PUMAs called MIG PUMAs. Because if I knew the PUMA that the person lives right now and the PUMA that the person lived exactly 1 year ago, I would also be able to identify individuals using public available data. So what the Census Bureau does, they group some of these PUMAs of previous residents and call them MIG PUMAs. So for this exercise, what I do, I also group the PUMAs in the destination. So we have these groups of PUMAs, which are the MIG PUMAs, 1,000 of them, and 1,000 of them, origin, destination. And then I compare to see if people moved from one place to the other. So I'm dividing the US in 100,000, 5 areas, which are my MIG PUMAs, right? So we group PUMAs of destination at the same geographic level as the origin. So instead of dividing the country in almost 2,400 areas, we divided a little more than 1,000 areas. This is a strategy to homogenize areas of previous and current residents. And this is just for you to see in the map. You have the states in red, and then the MIG PUMAs in black. And you also have, for example, this MIG PUMA here in black has several PUMAs within them in blue. But then you see, for example, some states that have not as big of population. This MIG PUMA here really big in geographical scale. So we lose some possibility of people moving within this area. Is not captured by this analysis. But it's still what we are doing here pretty much is dividing our map in these 1,005 areas, the MIG Pumas, which are shown here with the black borders, okay? And of course, in areas that we have higher population, we have smaller MIG Pumas in geographical scale comparing to some of these other states here, more in the middle and west of the country. How do I analyze these maps here that I'm going to show you? I call internal migrants those who reside in another MIG Puma 1 year before compared to where they live now. So we know if they live in one MIG Puma 1 year ago, where they live now. If they live in a different area, internal migrants. Those that live in the same area, non-migrants. And international migrants are those who reside in another country 1 year before and now are in a specific area in the US. But I will not include those people in my analysis here now. I will just look at where internal migrants are more likely to go within the US. And comparing also to some trends of non-migrants. So the map on the top left here is just showing the proportion of internal migrants for each one of the MIG Pumas. So the areas here in darker colors, we have between 7.5 and 17% of people moved into those areas between 2018 and 2015. So I'm estimating in-migration rates, and I'm showing them here in proportion. You can multiply by 100 to analyze in percentage terms. The white areas have between 0.7% and to 4% of people moving to those areas between 2018 and 19, taking into account the size of population in the area of destination. When we look at this map here on the top left, it's hard to understand it, right? Because it's so many colors, it's 1,000 areas, it's hard to understand a pattern. And that's where it comes, that local indicator of spatial association that I just used. I got the data from the EPUM's website from 2019 ACS, use Geoda, learn how to use it in the website of Geoda, and then it simplifies this map. It gets the data of this map, do a statistical analysis and show which are the clusters, the high cluster, low cluster, high-low outlier, and low-high outlier. And those areas that seems to don't have a significant cluster or outlier. In other words, you can have high and low levels of in-migration in those areas that are here in light gray, okay? So what we see, overall, for example, Florida, Texas, Colorado. Is it Colorado? I'm so bad with, that's correct, right? I'm so bad with American geography. And I'm doing research about it. Remember the names of these states is always a tricky thing. Receiving what? High levels of migration and those areas surrounded by high levels. So just compare here, this one here with this one. It's not the highest level, but has a high level surrounded by high. So that's red. This one here has high level surrounded by high. This one's here in Southern California. Low level surrounded by low. So it becomes dark blue, low cluster. In Texas, in Florida, high level surrounded by high. High level surrounded by high, they become red. Some of this pink here, for example, this one right here has high level of migration surrounded by low. That's why it's pink. And the light blue. For example, this one here, low, surrounded by high. So it becomes light blue, right? This one here, really low, surrounded by high, light blue. So this is the overall level of internal migration within the US between 2018 and 2015. Low levels of in-migration. These are people moving within the US, doesn't take into account international migrants. And low levels for all these areas here in dark blue. And then I break it by different subgroups of the population. So I look among non-migrants, people that did not move between 2018 and 19. Those that are US born and did not move within this period, they are more likely to have stayed in all these areas highlighted in red. Foreign born, people that were born in another country, moved to the US, but between 18 and 19 did not move, they are more likely to move here to these areas close to the southern border, close in California and also the Texas and also in Florida, and had really low chances of staying in the areas in dark blue. So just shows the contrast here between US born and foreign born non-migrants. What about the internal migrants broken down by nativity? Those born in the US and those born outside. These are people who were born outside of the US, and between 18 and 19, they moved within the US. Again, more likely to move to California, Texas, Florida, some areas around New York, and low chances of going to Midwestern areas into the southern states. US born internal migrants, more spread out, right? In different states, you see red areas and also the dark blue areas more spread out around the country. So here I'm breaking down those that did not move in the period between 18 and 19 by nativity, and those that moved between 18 and 19 by nativity. And in this map here, it's only for those that moved. All the maps below are for internal migrants, people that move between 18 and 19. But now I break them down by race ethnicity. Non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic Native Americans. And that's really interesting, right? Non-Hispanic whites that moved within the US. And those people here can be either US born or foreign born. But you see, less likely to move to California, Texas, southern states, and more likely to move to more upper West states, upper West areas. Non-Hispanic African Americans. For me, this is really interesting and this is talking about the return migration, right? In the Great Migration, a lot of African Americans moved from southern areas to the north. And what these studies in the textbook was saying, now you see the opposite trend. People going from the north to the south. And this result is showing that they're more likely to move to the southern areas. And this graph for me, this map for me here is really interesting to show the really low levels of migration of African Americans to half of the country. All these areas here receiving really low levels of internal migrants, African Americans. Hispanic, also another pattern. Right? Again, these Hispanics here can be either US born or foreign born. But those that move within the US, moving into areas closer to the southern border. Of course, more spread out, more farther away from the border, of course, but it's still in a really clear pattern here, different than what you saw for whites and African Americans. And low levels of them going to Midwest, to the Northeast, and also to the southern states. Native Americans, another pattern. Areas that usually have reservations are the ones receiving higher levels of internal migrants who are Native Americans, and low level in Midwestern states and the Northeast. So what are the reasons for each one of those? That's open to debate, but we can, if you understand a little bit of American history, if you understand where most of the international migrants coming nowadays to the US, even if it was a decline in Latin American immigration to the US, is still coming. And maybe this Hispanic population, because of ties, family ties, even if they are US born, they migrate more closer to those areas. Native Americans related to reservations, non-Hispanic whites, not moving exactly to areas where you have more Hispanics, creates segregation, right? And African Americans, for me, also really interesting. It shows the return migration to the South in this huge portion of the country that they are not moving to. Okay, so that's an ongoing research project that I already mentioned to you. And now what we're going to do is not only break the country in these MIG Pumas, the 1,000 MIG Pumas, but make this analysis at the county level, right? Using restricted data available here at the TXRDC at A&M. So here I finished this topic about internal migration. There is this extra topic about internal migration in China, but I will not cover it. And next week, on Tuesday and Thursday, I will cover the topic, the chapter on international migration, and then we finish the classes of the semester. And we have the final exam in the following week. Okay, so 2 more classes. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.